In a context where capitalist society has been tolerating and has been indifferent to the asymmetry of power between the laborers and the employers who per se have been oppressing these laborers, who has been committing massive layoffs with the excuse of economic crisis, we have been led to believe that state-given approvals or state-given rules and procedures would be a panacea to solve these problems. While we believe that these rules and procedures, these legislations, or these per se commissions or committees that actually decide the wage levels have been working complementary to the bargaining right, to the exercise of the bargaining rights or strikes in and of itself, we believe that this debate is about what is a more effective means in terms of actually confronting with these pressures that are given by the employers when it comes to securing the rights, securing the livelihood of each labor, right? With that being said, let's go on to the context of this debate. Madam Speaker, we believe that in the 70s and 80s, basically, when these laborers have been told to give up, when these laborers have been told to back up, we believe that there actually exists enough check and balance in terms of these laborers actually backing out in terms of a severe economic crisis. What do we mean by this? We see that when Sangyong Motors has been on the crisis of default, losing a lot of investment, and when they have been facing a layoff in 2008 because of the economic crisis, because of the financial crisis, what we've seen was laborers have been actually having 3 shifts. Laborers have been agreed to reducing their wages. Laborers have been agreeing to not being paid, but still working for 3 months or 4 months on an annual basis. What they were guaranteed was basically the promise that when economic crisis is over, when Sangyong is back on track, that they will be restored. In that case, that doesn't just happen in Korea or in East Asia or East Asia. We believe that many factories in Coltec Guitar or whatnot have been committing massive layoffs with the excuse of these economic crisis. But what we have seen after all, when majority of these corporations have been actually back on track, when they have been actually seeing a hike in their profits after Mahindra or after M&As that have been incorporating these smaller factories or smaller corporations into bigger corporations, what we have seen at the end of the day was no guarantee of per se. We believe that bargaining strikes that happen in the forms of not participating in working as not actually working in front of the conveyor belts, or actually these massive laborers actually pulling out, is exactly what directly impacts the laborers. So the debate that we're having, what OG provides to you is whether the legislation that has been conducted in the forms of giving the rules of procedures, like codifying when these employers can fire, what are the justified circumstances when these employers fire, actually have been working as a rationale or justification for these employers. Why is this? Because we believe that in a legal system where it's very hard to assess whether this corporation has been going through an economic crisis, whether this was an investment, whether this was an inevitable choice, when the legal precedents prove that in most of these cases it was very hard to prove whether the burden can be ascribed to the corporations. In the precedent of Coltec Guitar, or in the precedent of Sangyong Motors, what we see is legal precedents or the juries have often ruled in favor of the corporations, defending the corporations' rights to actually fire these people. We believe that when the legislation cannot do an enough job or sufficient job in terms of securing these laborers, what actually can guarantee restoration of these laborers to go back to work, or restoration of these laborers' wages, would necessarily be per se having a direct impact. Why does direct impact work? We believe that on the second level analysis, Madam Speaker, employers have no motivation or no incentive per se to restore as long as it doesn't impact their success or impact their margins. In other words, when these laborers when laborers actually pull out from the conveyor belts, when it actually, not only in terms of having a direct harm on these corporations, but on the second level, in terms of instigating the public opinion on why this is actually a bad thing. When 37 people actually committed suicide, we believe that this sort of instigation of public opinion is that what directly actually impacts the corporation's margins or corporation profits that leads these people to move. In other words, we think that with a high joining enrollment rate of labor unions, and the strengthening of the labor unions as an ideal state with an ideal state per se that the states have to go through, like in the case of Germany, where they actually see industrial levels of labor unions that are guaranteed of their rights. We believe that more aggressive exercise of these rights is the only way to actually restore these things at the end of the day, right? But on the second level, Mr. Speaker, why does wage level or the deciding of the wage itself does not work? What do you mean by this? We do see that the United States in July actually has been having this commission or committee that actually decides wage level. Same thing happens in Korea, same thing happens in all around the world. The problem is, when it is necessarily still cannot thwarting the asymmetry of balance, even between the even between the meeting of per se the representative of the employers or the representative of the laborers, the government in and of itself, we believe that it has to depend on the political ideology of the incumbent political party at the end of the day. What do we mean by this? When we say per se Republican parties actually having a hold or actually having the majority of the Congress, or when it actually has much political affiliations with these employers, what we see is still that asymmetry of power exists even within the commission. But on the second level, Mr. Madam Speaker, we also tell you why wage level per se is a myth. In other words, we do agree that a rise in $14 in California may be a good thing if the best case scenario coming from opposition per se, that it increases consumption power. What's problematic is the burden now falls into mom and pop business stores who actually have to hire these laborers at the end of the day. What we mean by this is when it should be rather the corporations and the conglomerates who actually hire these subcontractors, who actually hire these workers, who should be pressurized to not just pay in terms of wage levels, but to per se guarantee better conditions, better working conditions, or to better actually grant rights or whatnot. Yes.
Okay, so presumably the Congress is politically tied in many ways, but isn't the union also subject to various political pressures by what issues they choose to pursue?
We think that when per se Republican Party that goes for corporations' rights, which is already enoughly sufficiently backed up, and it's not questioned per se with the livelihood of the workers, we think that when asymmetry of balance and per se not enough political capital has been backing up labor unions, what we need is per se more backing up and more sufficient influx of political capital and economic capital that can be concentrated and used to back up these labor unions at the end of the day. So we don't think it's necessarily sufficient. We think that at the end of the day, that's what actually balances out the political asymmetry between those two ideologies. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, when most of the states actually are based on these mom and pop stores, we think the burden now falls into the hands of these mom and pop stores who have to hire. In other words, in order for consumption power to actually work, and in order for increase of wage level to a significant extent should be using the consumption power, it should be that I as a owner of a mom and pop business store who actually hires a part-timer should be able, is now forced to actually pay much when I am in and of myself am not making enough profits. That's the reason why when it comes to conglomerates actually having to burden these things, they should be the ones who should be pressurized to guarantee, because at the end of the day, we think the power that comes from these laborers is what tackles in cases of inevitable crisis at the end of the day. So for all of those reasons, opening government is proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for the fine speech. We welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Before we can really have a very productive round in today's debate, we need to have a pretty clear idea of what the world on each side really is. So on the side of the government, they're advocating for stronger bargaining power on the side of the unions. What does this mean? First, we need to understand what unions actually do, which isn't something that the opening government has really explained in today's round. In a lot of the parts of the world, the unions aren't these small organizations. They're these large, across the entire labor market encompassing organizations. They are all teachers, they are all farmers, they are all factory workers. These aren't these small organizations that are super diverse, that are that have a lot of voices within them. Instead, the way that unions generally work is that they make their members pay a due. They're giant bureaucracies that are controlled by the people at the very top of the unions, and they propose policies that they require all members to follow, or else they kick the members out of the unions. I'm going to explain why this is problematic in a little bit. What are we advocating on the opposition side of the House? We're advocating more of the status quo, where the legislation listens to all the different workers, all the different political interests, and all the different special interest groups, and then together creates a policy that affects different labor markets. We're not saying that this has to be uniform. We can say that the government can propose a policy that affects teachers differently than it does factory workers. We're also proposing that in the status quo, in a lot of places such as the United States, state governments create labor policies that affect different states. So the minimum wage in New York and in America isn't the same as in North Carolina or Vermont. It can be more tailored, whereas unions aren't necessarily going to be this tailored. So first, with a little bit of rebuttal. So first of all, they're talking about how we need to be securing the livelihood. We also need to be securing the quality of life and the kind of work environment in which the teachers and the different workers live. So not only are we looking for a fair wage, we're also looking for flexibility for workers, because it's really unpleasant for a worker not to be able to determine their own work hours, how they work, where they work, etc. Then they talk about how In their first point, they talk about how laborers are agreeing to lower wages and how legislation is protecting employees, but they never really explain the role that unions play in this. They're assuming that just because a union is stronger, that the legislation is automatically going to care. We're going to argue that this isn't the only way for this to happen. If they want the legislation to listen and benefit the workers, all you need to do is to politically mobilize the workers, which doesn't need to come in the way of unions, because these individual workers can create their own smaller groups that don't have to be uniform across an entire industry. For example, farmers in one part of the state can have a different idea than other parts of the state, and they're not really allowing for this diversity within this field to occur. But their second point is deciding how wages are. They say that wages aren't working because it really depends on the incumbent party. But first of all, the parties are selected to people, so they're still going to be responsible and have to be responsive, or else they're going to be voted out. So the way that political parties work isn't really that different from the way that unions work. So they're going to have to provide a little bit of differential here. And we're actually going to say that allowing the political party to decide for all people is actually going to be better, because they're going to be looking towards the interests of all people and not solely be driven by single unions.
Yes, so if you agree that political mobilization is your ultimate goal, how the smaller organizations, not in the form of labor unions with strong power per se, need these groups that don't have individual power, but secondly prove to us why, when rules of procedures justify layoffs based on competence of worker, how that would actually contribute to the increase of quality of the livelihood.
Okay, so what exactly are you asking? Do you mind repeating really quickly?
We're asking if you agree to the idea that it's political mobilization that concentrates these influx of these capital of these workers, how does your small firms that are not heads of these labor unions actually lead these workers to begin with? But please prove to us why rules of procedures codify and justify per se these massive layoffs on competence actually work.
Okay, so you're basically asking me how I'm going to get political mobilization. So we're not saying that unions shouldn't exist. That's not the burden of the opposition to prove. We're just saying that these overpowering, strong unions aren't the way to do it. That we think that there should be ways for the individual workers to create their own, if they have a different idea that opposes their union, then they don't have to be forced into the union's point of view. There are a lot of different ways to get mobilization that doesn't force all teachers into the same box, all farm workers into the same box, which actually leads me into my first point of substantive. Why having really, really strong unions actually hurts workers in the industry. So because of the way that unions work and because of the way that they are a bureaucracy, it necessarily means that as unions get stronger, there are fewer and fewer alternative paths for workers to get their voices heard. So for example, if I'm a teacher in my state and I don't agree with the union and I want to get my voice heard, as a union grows stronger and becomes the overwhelming and largely legitimized and accepted way that this is the only way that workers are going to get their voices heard, like the government is proposing, they're basically proposing that if a teacher wants to get their voices heard, it's going to be through the head of the labor union. So say I'm a teacher that doesn't agree with this labor union. If in a lot of states where labor unions have a lot of power in the status quo, the only way to be a teacher is to join the union. So what this means for teachers in these unions is that the heads of these unions that are controlled by the majority of the teachers are then just saying, are determining their pay, are determining their work hours, and this has several impacts. First of all, this is going to be decreasing flexibility for individual workers and forcing them all into the same box. For example, a teacher in my high school said that he refused to move into a state in which the unions were very powerful because they were decreeing that all teachers had to work from 8 to 4. This sounds really great because it means that schools can't force teachers to work long hours, but on the flip side, it reduces the flexibility of teachers to choose their own hours. He was saying that maybe some days he wanted to come in a little bit earlier or stay later to work with students, but the union was telling him that he wasn't allowed to do that, or else he was going to be kicked out and wouldn't be able to teach and work in that state. This is incredibly, incredibly harmful because this decreases job satisfaction. It decreases the independence and the willingness of people to join these industries if they don't agree with the unions. So you're going to get fewer people wanting to join if they dissent, and you're going to get a lower quality of work in these areas. The second bad thing is that because unions are so overwhelming, it's going to make sure that certain people get protected that maybe don't deserve to be protected. For example, if unions are very overpowering, then they control the voices within that group as well. Because because of the way the unions work, if you have to join a union in order to work in that occupation, you really want to join that occupation but don't agree, then automatically your voice is going to be silenced within this majority. We're thinking on side opposition, we believe that this silences dissenters, it provides less flexibility, and it overwhelmingly puts workers into a box in which they perhaps don't want to be. And the second substantive point that my partner is going to get into more in her speech is that it's actually going to hurt all workers in these states. Why is this so? Because unions are special interest groups that only that are self-interested and are only interested in the majority, not even all teachers, but perhaps like the majority of teachers or the more powerful teachers in the state, it's not going to consider the needs of other workers in other industries in the state. So for example, you're going to get policies as they lobby politicians. If they become the only lobby group that don't give smaller voices the opportunity to be heard, larger unions or larger industries and states are going to control the politics and control the wages, and this is going to be harmful for other reasons that my partner will get into.
We thank the Leader of the Opposition for a fine speech. We welcome the Prime Minister to continue.
Madam Speaker, what this debate is about is how to guarantee those people who are in the weaker status from the beginning. The default setting is that these people, the employees, have lower power because of whether it be a hierarchy, because of the asymmetry of information, because of all these other systematic problems that they have. They often result in the losing of the lawsuits, even when they get into the lawsuit, not to mention all these times that it takes for them to even gain a victory, if it's possible in the first place. And in that process, the government or the employers all have that power to actually utilize all the other existing systematic utilities. For example, policing force. For example, other rules and laws that are designed to actually discriminate these people. We believe that in those cases, we believe that these laborers' rights are actually incrementally more important in guaranteeing, for example, the quality of education, let's say, or for example, the quality of that production in the factories per se. We believe that in those cases, we have to actually guarantee these people to do their own jobs, to actually choose their own rights and choose their own welfare systems and actually get their own welfares instead of the top-down approach, saying that the government or the legislations actually expecting those legislations to do what is actually there for them, and even if those legislations actually succeed in being legislated to guarantee their rights, we don't believe that it's going to be, in most of the cases, suitable for these laborers and these labor conditions. That's why we believe that it's much better to have the bottom-up approach and have these collective bargaining rights and protections rather than legislative and uniform labor market regulations imposed upon by the government. No, thank you. We believe that we've shown you enough already in the abusive cases of, for example, the South Korean car industry, Sangyong, and how it laid off massive laborers, or for example, in other parts of the world where the laborers' rights were actually abused and sacrificed in the excuse that the management was actually bad, in the excuse that the company was in a bad business. We believe that in those cases, the management actually had a much better rationale, much better excuse per se in laying off these, and even when their management gets back on the hikes and businesses, and when these people had the luxury of hiring back these sacked laborers, we believe that they don't actually do that. They have a much more room to maneuver in not actually having these laborers back into the business because of, for example, profit maximization. Because of, for example, they had more information, more management structures information that actually works in favor of them in the legal system, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we believe that these labor unions don't have much room to maneuver. And I'm going to also, in addition to that, show you how, even in the cases of labor legislations, how this flexibility that the opposition side so clings onto is actually much better achieved in our side of the model. how that flexibility is worked better when that labor union themselves actually work, no thank you, to gain their rights, instead of having to rely on or expecting these top-down approaches, the government legislators to bring it down for them, in which there's no guarantee that these legislations or the compromises would actually be suitable for individual businesses that they claim for. But before moving on to these, I'd like to take a POI. From closing, no? Yeah.
Sure. So laws aren't just about taking it to court, it's also about the government having the legitimacy of conducting investigations into legal violations. Why then does it matter if people can't win court cases if they just have yearly reviews by international or national boards?
Well, again, I'd like to point out that there's no guarantee in those systems working in favor of the laborers if the laborers themselves don't have any say in that process. We believe that the political capital that they, again, so cling on for, is not really working. Why is that? They seem to go for example, the smaller labor unions themselves, the diverse needs, but then again, in that case, I can't really understand why the smaller the unions are, the better political bargaining power they have, because the common sense tells me that it's the other way around. When the group is smaller, then you have less political bargaining chip, and therefore less say in the entire political businesses, right? Well, when the government actually legislates versus the unions themselves actually asking for what they actually need, it's actually very evident which side would fit to the very needs of the diverse laborers themselves. That's why our model fits to your goals better. No, thank you. We believe that even when unions are overpowered, even when there are low working opportunities, they're all good, they're all excuses, but then again, how can you guarantee, even in the worst case scenario, these laborers' rights when they don't have, in the current system, when they don't have that power balance that can overpower the legislatures or, for example, the employers that currently have systematically more power, ladies and gentlemen, because of the hierarchy, because of the personnel powers, because of the information of the management, whatever it may be, or because of the systematic over-empowerment, for example, the policing forces. We believe that these employers have much more power, and that's why we need that counter-narrative, counterbalancing force that should be given to the labor unions themselves. Now, moving on to my constructive argument of the flexibility. Ladies and gentlemen, when the solution is to be reached, the experts actually say flexible minds are the best. Which by the means is that when each of these individual workers' conditions may differ, and these industries, their conditions may differ, and their requirements may differ, we believe that we need flexible minds in order to reach a definite conclusion. But then again, which would be actually better in reaching that flexible conclusion, flexible compromise between them, between the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach? Of course, the bottom-up approach, because they know what the conditions are themselves. They know what the requirements are by themselves. That's why one solution that may work in this may not work on the other side. One solution for the teachers that they say may not work for the factory workers. Now they say they have all these different labor unions for that, but then again, ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't work. We've already proven you why the smaller group of political bargaining chips, the lower the political bargaining power becomes. And that's why we need the labor unions to be bigger, and we need the labor unions to actually have factions underneath that, but then again, at least unite together in order to address the powerful people that powerful employers. And we believe that in that sense, it's much better for us to have, it's much less profitable for us to have a uniform policy provided by the government that provides uniform policies given to every single situation, rather than these labor unions themselves actually ask for what they actually need, that which would actually empower their negotiation processes, which would actually increase the likelihood of negotiation, therefore empowering the narratives themselves that the labor unions are actually asking for something viable instead of the over-empowerment, or instead of asking something that is not viable. In those cases, we believe that in any of the cases, labor unions themselves are much better choices than the government legislations proud to propose.
We thank the DPM for his fine speech. We welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the
Mr. Speaker, let's be true. How we see unions is not the way that the government would like to present them. Their only reason as to why they think unions are better is because they believe that stronger unions will have some type of political power. If political power is the way that we control some type of gains in today's debate, on this side of the House, we're going to show you how we create better political power and more diverse, as well as political power that can be consented to better by the people who belong to it on our side. I'm going to be talking to you about a couple things. First of all, I'm going to explain to you how unions get power, why this creates an essentializing force, and why this is harmful to the members inside of it as well as those outside of it. Then I'm going to talk to you about other alternatives, such as nonprofits, coalitions of those, in which we can create the same type of political power in terms of numbers, however better and better representing of it. First, on a couple pieces of extraneous rebuttal. Essentially, the entire portion of their case is set up against this harm that they provide you with, like the Moores example, and their second point about like political affiliation with employers. Essentially, the argument here is that corporations are entrenched in politics, and that you need a large political force to combat these types of politics, because it's hard to get some type of political concessions. We agree here, and we agree that it is hard to get political concessions. 4 responses. First of all, they only argued by example. They never gave you any mechanism as to why unions would be better than other groups in order to create some type of large political action. By their logic, all we need are large numbers. They never answer as to why maybe large political parties like Democrats or Republicans would be better getting these concessions. If we're looking at numbers, I'll show you how we can get numbers on our side of the House with better and diverse representation. Second of all, we're going to show you why the political power of like nonprofits, for example, like can create this type of political force with better representation. And also their argument here is only that like maybe nonprofits should get better at creating coalitions and getting some type of political concessions as opposed to unions. Unions are particularly harmful. The second thing we get out of them is that like it's very difficult in terms of legal avenues because juries defend corporations. Again, they said employers have no incentive because they have no direct impact. I'm going to show you why unions actually have no incentive to listen to diverse opinions within their own sphere, because essentially what they're appealing to is the lowest common denominator. So when you're looking to who has like an incentive to create more of an impact, it's not going to fall on like some type of union. It's going to fall within special interest groups. So we're looking to those. I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about like how unions get power before I move on to defending our case. So, unions get power by lobbying and bargaining. This comes in generally 2 forms most of the time. You see unions when they boycott a certain phenomenon that's occurring, or when they fund a certain politician. How do you get enough numbers to boycott? How do you get enough funds? Purely by membership. First of all, you need the amount of people there to have a legitimate threat of boycotting, and you need enough money coming from dues to fund certain candidates. Now, what does this create? First of all, the incentive to jack up dues once you have enough people in it. Once you have enough people who are members, if you're outside of the union, you're not going to have a large political force. You basically are coerced into joining it. They jack up the dues. Who does this hurt? Young teachers, teachers who just came out of college, people like immigrant teachers, all these teachers who are trying to join these teacher unions are basically screwed out of a system because either they join it and are coerced by the large political force of the unions, or stay outside of it and do not gain concessions that unions gain exclusively for their members, which was completely ignored on your side, the harms to people who do not join these large unions, especially when your only link here is that you want the largest membership possible. Think about the people outside of that who refuse to join it because it does not align with their political beliefs. You exclusively leave those people out and leave them to the mercy of these corporations who you think are so horrible. Well, I'll take you now.
We think that it's you actually bandwagoning the effect of labor unions guarantee when the fear of getting fired is exclusively comes from low membership. But please prove to us, when police enforcement stands by the side of the state by defining most protests as illegal, how does your state approvals of legislation actually lead to these empowerments?
Okay, so on the topic of state legislation and political force, if we're looking to the government not letting protests happen, I don't understand how you're really going to get that on your side of the house anyway with unions. But so long as we have to deal with protests being banned, we don't need to have protests on our side. All I need to have is nonprofits with enough money, lower membership dues, less coercive status, who form coalitions of different nonprofits who represent diverse opinions to work towards a common goal. It's less coercive. You get the same goal except better on our side with less coercive and more consent. Okay, moving on from there. The next thing I want to talk about is a couple bits of rebuttal. So, Kat provides you the idea that was completely unresponded to, that is harmful for those outside unions. She gives the example of teachers and flexibility with specific hours. This is one example of it. There are plenty more we could provide for you, but the concept is still there. Essentially, you opt into a program that goes towards the lowest common denominator. Essentially, unions mandate types of hours for these teachers because it creates a stable outcome. It is stable because they can now control salary and they can control the amount of hours that teacher actually performs. However, it is coercive for those who want to live a different type of lifestyle. You only gain concessions for your members, not those outside of it. But the ones who are in it have to deal with coercive policies. This is unresponded to because it hurts the most vulnerable groups who are not going to be in those. So it's going to hurt like young immigrant teachers. It's going to hurt like the youngest teachers who came out of college, the most innovative ones. You're going to hurt like the ones who like recently moved to other states. This is going to be very crucial here when we have these like large political bodies whose incentive is to gain more large memberships. Moving on from there, I want to talk about like certain protections that Kat brought to you. Essentially, she provided to you why they have to control the voices in the group. This is pretty self-explanatory. Unions need to do this because they need to stay some type of like cohesive group to gain some type of power. This turns into pretty coercive measures. But basically, the only response that we get to this is that smaller groups are bad, you have less power. 3 responses to this. 1, this is not an argument for unions, it's just an argument that groups need to create coalitions. Second of all, nonprofits are better. So, why are nonprofits better? You don't necessarily have to pay a due to join a nonprofit. To join a nonprofit organization, all you need to do is politically affiliate with them, join some type of membership, not necessarily as coercive as that. But second of all, you're not screwed if you leave a nonprofit organization. There isn't this type of coercive control over your hours. You do not have to sign a contract when you enter into a nonprofit organization. However, they can still create the same type of political power as unions do. When you join a nonprofit organization or a different special interest group, essentially what you do is you have your diverse opinions supported. So if you don't want to work the 9 to 5 hours, you can gain that within a nonprofit as opposed to a union. What we need then is a couple nonprofits to like create a coalition and a political force. It's not an argument for unions to do that. You basically aren't as coerced in that. Plus, it helps out people who are like young teachers, immigrants who move to other states, and things like that because it is easier for them to join these groups. It is more diverse for their opinions. You get like more diversity in terms of the type of political reforms you get, and it's not so essentializing. You're able to consent to essentially the things that are being put forward by your group better. The other thing here is that like these types of unions are essentially damning to the people who either join them or don't. Your options are very clear. You either join this union and are subject to the political force of the bureaucratic nature of it, or you don't join it and you're subject to like the ebb and flow of the market on its own without any protections. For these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
We thank the DLO. We move to the second half of this debate and the government member to continue.
Look, the problem with this debate is entirely not comparative, in the sense that this should not be a debate whether unions are good or bad, but whether they have an alternative measures of obtaining this kind of rights, right? Rather than legislation change is somehow better than all the collective bargaining rights that we want to propose, right? We do agree that unions have certain problems. We do agree that also unions are intrinsically different around the world, right? Because European unions most of the time do not really represent these big conglomerates that you can only join one union. You can have a diversity and you can join more than one union in deciding whether you want to direct your rights to a part of a union or to a collective that should support you, right? We think that this is extremely interesting, right? So in the moment when you give the power to the unions, first of all, we tell you that the interest of the union, for most important, is to represent the workers in their negotiation, right? Which means it has their best interest. It has the interest to achieve more rights and gain more power towards them, which means that they're not going to be inclined to neglect people that have a strong voice and a reasonable voice, right? They will have them integrated within this kind of union. You will have that opinion integrated within this kind of union. If they're not going to do this kind of things, they might suffer because they gain their power from the membership of the population, which is in certain states obviously somehow by the law you have to be a member union. In other states, in European states, you do not have to be a member of a certain union, right? So because they get the power from the members, they have to work in their interest. Other than that, people might be able to leave this kind of union and create another collective bargaining group or create another union that supports their interests, right? We have this kind of case. We think that by giving them more power, you also create more diversity in the sense that you have people realizing that this is the way we should change, and maybe we should not listen to the same old union. We should create a union or a different collective bargaining group on our own, right? We think that this is extremely interesting, right? Now, the whole idea of the people that are not listened and have different needs. We're saying that on the comparative, not even their case, this kind of people, because they do not represent a majority, have no ability to change anything, right? Because also in our case, they can join NGOs, they can put political pressure, whatever. But in their case, in their case, they can't get any kind of political representation because they're not part of the majority, because they have no intrinsic ability to change the mind of the politician, of the representative, to change these kind of things, right? We think that this is clear on our side, right? Now, I'm gonna move on to our own extension, because we think that basically this the kind of debate, it manages to get to a debate of either you have collective rights in which you give groups rights to a people and certain groups, so either you get them individual rights, right, through legislation, which you say that each and every person has the right to minimum wage or certain working conditions, right? And we think that this kind of debate has a majority in varieties, like it's representing different varieties of capitalism, right? When you have controlled market economies, such as the European economy, such as Germany, you have more collective rights, but in other cases, such as in the UK and the United States, you have more individual rights, but you get no much power for the group as a whole, which means that we prefer the controlled market economy because we think that clearly it's protecting more the workers, it's creating less unemployment, and it's bringing better prices for the whole economy. Why is this so? Because in the moment when you get more power to the unions, you get them more members, and you force somehow people to adhere to this kind of unions or create other unions that are extremely important. You give them more power, and further of all, you give them more money in the way that they have the ability to influence the whole political spectrum and how they're fighting against their certain entrepreneurs or whatever, right? In the liberal market economy, we think that it's easier to change the legislation. Why is this so? Because you have the lobby pressure, and you have big conglomerate groups such as Walmart and big employees that have the ability to buy politicians and provide certain pieces of legislation in order to abuse these kind of workers when you have no collective bargaining rights, right? Even if you have a legislation that is somehow solid in rights, you might be able to come through a point of crisis within that state, and this is clearly damaging because you might abuse the workers when you come to a point of crisis, right? See the Southern European Union economies. It was really easy for these states, right, to change their legislation because they had the ability to lobby and they have the ability to lie to their people and imposing legislation onto them because there was no collective bargaining right power that can defend this kind of thing. We think that this is extremely problematic, and it creates less representation for the people and less rights in terms when they need it the most, right, in terms of economic crisis. Closing.
When solidarity within the union is the whole goal of why workers actually want to join the union, why would the union have any incentives to protect those individuals outside of the union when hiring is a zero-sum game?
Right, I've already dealt with this point, right? Now, we think that is extremely different between these two types of economies. Why we need economy with more collective rights, we think that it brings people that are more secure on their jobs, which means two basic things, right? The first thing is that they cannot be fired, and you cannot create the levels of unemployment that cause so much harms in European economies after the crisis. Second of all, it means that they're going to be more efficient and more proficient within their own job, within their own job, right? Because in a liberal market economy where they can be laid off anyhow, they have no interest in gaining more skills to that particular job because they might not have the job in the next month, right? Which means that you get a more specialization and more ability to work in merchandise or in engineering within controlled market economies with collective bargaining rights. See Germany and other European states that have an extreme good economy in developing like cars and mechanical engineering. People have this specialty to do this kind of thing, right? On the other hand, you have the ability that you cannot lay off people such easy, right? So in terms of prices, how does this work? Because in the moment when you have collective rights, you cannot lay off people such easily, which means that you cannot reduce your production, which means that you're producing the same amount of productions even in terms of market shocks and so on and so forth. You have to decrease the prices, which means that you certainly prefer that the economy of that certain enterprise, of a certain business, they get less profit, but they pay the same amount of workers, they support the same kind of thing to the workers, which means that most of the money in terms of economic shocks also is brought and only stable to the population, is not only bring into the pockets by the top 1% in the economies, right? This is why this is why we need collective rights, right? Rather than individual rights. And no longer, we think that it's extremely important to have a direct negotiation rather than legislation, because legislation is incredibly powerful, interpreted by politicians that are not represented and by lobbyists that have the ability to buy these politicians and pass whatever legislation they want to.
We thank the government member and we welcome the opposition to extend their side.
The enormous problem with unions is that they just cannot balance the needs of the corporation with the needs of the laborers within that workforce. That is one of the most important factors in today's round, is that legislation effectively balances the needs of both the corporation and the laborers in order to create flexible economies that can actually adapt to economic shocks rather than artificially retaining employees that they can't actually afford to retain. 2 points of extension in this debate. First, how legislation effectively balances the needs of corporations and employees. Second, how unions are actually ineffective at protecting workers. First, 2 pieces of rebuttal. First piece of rebuttal, that people can simply create new unions and avoid the union that currently operates within that particular economic sphere. The problem is that in government's world, for them to actually have effective unions, they have to mandate that all employees join the union upon being hired at that particular position. For instance, in the United States, we made laws that said that unions could not mandate that employees join the union, which effectively stripped the union of any efficacy. So in Gov's world, they're mandating that people join the unions in order to actually have any efficacy. Second, on this idea that legislation can just be changed. Well, presumably union leaders can also just be bribed if that's how how much the government has an incentive to manipulate some sort of market. Like, I think that can effectively happen as well, and probably a little bit easier than just changing the legislation. No. Okay. First point of extension about how the legislation balances the needs of laborers and corporations. So corporations desperately need to be able to adapt to economic conditions. This includes things like restructuring, this includes things like firing inefficient workers. The problem is that when the stated goal of the union is simply to retain workers and retain the adequate wage markers, the problem is that you cannot fire inefficient workers. So see the problems in the United States with things like the teachers union. What happens is you just cannot fire inefficient teachers, which means that you have to reduce wage levels across the board because you're effectively subsidizing teachers who don't even teach classes. They just sit in a room. So what that means is you get across the board worse wages when you're trying to pay inefficient workers who could have just been fired, and then those wages be translated to the workers who remain. But then what we would also say is that OG basically argues that firms should be forced to retain workers regardless of economic needs of the corporation. This is a huge problem because in the history of the US, I know I'm using a lot of US, but the US had a really interesting transition from being a relatively strong labor market economy that focused on unions to one that focused on legislation. So it's actually quite relevant example. So the example here is that when the US actually had very strong unions, what it started to do was drive firms away from the United States. Why did this happen? Because firms no longer wanted to have to accommodate the needs of the unions, and wages remained stagnant because of the fact that corporations started to exit the economy because they did not want to have to constantly change their policies in order to match up with what the unions were demanding. So strong unions actually tend to drive firms away, which hurts economies across the board far larger than any sort of minor impacts to firing particular employees. But what we would also tell you is that legislation is quite good. So this is what I was getting at in my POI that I think is extraordinarily important. Essentially here is that legislation isn't just about taking suits to court, but it's actually about having stipulations that require annual or monthly investigations into the working conditions of particular firms or of particular sectors. That's really important. It doesn't matter that OG says you can't win any sort of suits because you don't even have to sue in the first place because the government is already investigating if there are violations. So actually that's really important here. I think this proves that the legislation is effective and mandates investigation regardless of which sectors of the economy you work in. Okay, second argument about how unions are ineffective at protecting workers. I think this is essential in today's debate because the assumption underlying all of the government case is that unions will effectively protect workers and consistently protect them. They don't prove this. Why don't they prove this? The union's primary interest is, yes, in protecting current workers, but the problem here is that they prevent and actively prevent the hiring of new new laborers within that particular corporation. Why is this a problem? Because essentially what they prioritize is their current members of that particular union, which often are older workers or are workers who, for instance, have much higher levels of employment than they should have, which means that young people get disproportionately locked out of entering new jobs into the economy. See Greece, which has massive economic stagnation as a result of having a generation that just cannot find employment. The problem here is that those young people then delay entering the labor force for much longer, which means that those workers never actually get experience within the workforce. But what we could also say is that in a world where you have large-scale unions, the necessary trade-off is that you diminish legislation. Why is this so important? Because the government can use the excuse of, oh, just go to your union, we don't need to pass legislation, and then what happens is, if you work in a sector that doesn't have a huge amount of workers within that sector, you don't have any political efficacy against the government. But rather what we tell you is that legislation can be widely based and broad scale across the board. It doesn't matter what particular workforce you're in or what sector you're in, all have to have a standard minimum wage. But also what we tell you is legislation can be particularly tailored. So for instance, if you work in the coal industry, the coal industry can particularly campaign for their needs. And we think additionally that oftentimes governments do have incentives to pursue legislation, but a lot of conservative governments won't do it when there are unions because they view unions as diametrically opposed to the needs of corporations, and given many conservative governments are relatively in favor of corporations, they don't pursue this. But what else is very important? So unions also don't work primarily for service sector economies. So this is extremely important. So even if you try and encourage unions, they oftentimes aren't effective in many developed economies. So why is this important essentially? Because service sector are often smaller corporations and smaller firms, which means that they have far less actual political clout when they have to take anything to the government. So those unions don't even end up helping the workers, but they also don't have the legislation to fall back on when that union fails them. I'll take a POI from back half for you. Yeah.
Man, stop talking about unions, about political bargaining power. We don't care what kind of ways that the unions are run, in a right way, in a wrong way. How do you guarantee the legislation without the political bargaining power of the laborers?
Okay, so first of all, I think all of OO's material was about how oftentimes laborers do come together collectively in order to campaign for higher wage laws. What we'd also tell you is that oftentimes the problem here is that unions don't actually do an effective job in many sectors of the economy. So why is this a problem? It means that, and also obviously Gov's world is a trade-off with legislation. So it's odd to me that they're now saying that they can get both legislation and unions. But what we would also tell you is that the huge problem here is that unions, they also just said that unions are oftentimes bad, so it's unclear to me why unions would even pursue good political mechanisms. But we also tell you that unions don't often push for those kind of things, because the people at the top, if they are allowing people if they mandate people to join the union now has no incentive to actually be responsive to the needs of the employees that are part of that particular union, because they can't leave the union. So in their world where you have stronger unions, they have even less of an incentive to become responsive to the needs of their particular populations, because they just mandate that they join anyway, so they don't even have meaningful alternatives. So it doesn't mean that the union has to even accommodate the needs of their workers. For these reasons, proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the opposition member for a fine speech. Welcome the government to continue there.
So in order to sum up this debate on the government side, I believe that I really need to address two main premises that each of the opposition team has made during their speeches, right? And I believe that the first opposition actually talked about how the coercion and the power of the kind of political power of unions is really hurts the vulnerable people, right? And I really want to point out that on their side, this is not at all comparative, right? Why? Because the way that unions work, we believe that we have way more chances to actually make people's opinions being heard than in their word, because the only alternatives that we've heard during this debate was either having the state legislating every single piece of labor law, either having NGOs, either having nothing, right? So we believe that because of the fact that all the disadvantages that all the bench of the opposition has addressed during this debate failed to prove that in their world would actually be mitigated or at least diminuted by a really small margin, we believe that we win this debate. Why? Because of the speciality of unions and the way that they work. Because we believe that when it's way easier for you to, for example, force the stepping down of a leader of union. It is way more advantageous for you as a worker to be in a union. And if they want to call for a mandate for the union, for every single worker to work in a union, we believe that we have already told you how they have diversification. But also, if they actually believe that the people that are let down and are outside the union do not suffer because they don't have access to the advantages that the workers of the union have, they actually agree of the fact that every single people that do have membership of the union are way better off, right? Second premise of the closing opposition, their whole case is based on the fact that unions create inefficiency in a capitalistic world, because, well, it's kind of hard for you to hire people when they become inefficient, and we believe that we really need to address the point on for whom are these unions most relevant in an economy, because if you want to refer to the middle class, that's for whom unions are the most relevant, because that's where unions make the most relevant impact on securing certain jobs, right? And we believe that if they want to talk about a lot of restructuring at big corporations, I'm going to talk to you in my speech how, because of the fact that these unions are the most relevant for the biggest part of the society, which is low class and middle class people, because for example, top 1% does not necessarily need the security that labor unions work, we believe that because of the fact that the masses of the economy are affected by this security, on the comparative, we are way better off in an inefficiency on the economic level to actually have stability. No, thank you. Two main points in my speech. First of all, the power of unions and how a collaborative-oriented capitalism is way better off in times of crisis, in times of austerity, in times of economical development whatsoever. Second of all, about flexibility, addressing their extension. No, thank you. Now, the power of unions. We believe that in their world, the vague laws that allow every single interpretation of politicians to do whatever they want and fire people for whatever reason they want, they actually live in a cold capitalistic society where each worker's right is highly contingent and reliant on every single interpretation of law that some corporation has the interest to offer, right? So we believe that because of the lobby power of corporation, for example, environmental corporations, which might not necessarily agree with furthering the standards of their working conditions, your rights as a worker is highly contingent and reliant on a certain opinion of a certain time. No, thank you. Now, the relevance of collectivization of rights is that they offer stability, right? And here we talked about how allowing people to feel backed up and secure by a certain entity like a union, it means less unemployment in times of crisis. Why? Because you don't allow big agents like corporations to fire on grounds of inefficiency, which might not even be so, because it just might be that you're losing profit because of other external factors. But in their world, you are allowed to actually fire somebody because they're inefficient when they're not. But you just need to lay people off in order for you to further your profit, right? So on the comparative, you're in their world, you're hurting the most vulnerable people, which is the middle class that needs the stable jobs even more. Why? Because the working class is the ones that don't necessarily have access to social mobility like the other classes do, right? And for this kind of people, labor unions do the most of the job. These are the people that are most being hurt, right? Now, closing.
Question. Okay, so you can see that oftentimes unions will make corporations inefficient. If that's true, why won't that decrease economic growth across the country and hurt all laborers, including those that exist outside of the current job sphere?
It won't, because unions are able to adapt themselves. When a corporation has problems with, like, for example, not obtaining the same margin of profit because they can't allow to pay the same salary to the worker, the union is able to not necessarily offer the same bargaining chip. Like, for example, keep them working there, keep all your 100 workers there working for 8 hours and pay them the same salary, but they're also able to adapt themselves and telling, keep 50 workers there on a 4-hour working day, like, for example, right? But also keep the others. So they're able to adapt themselves in order for them to keep a margin of stability in every single case. On the comparative, in this case that I just explained, in their world, all 100 workers would actually be laid off, right? So we believe that because of the fact that the flexibility of unions is so encouraged in a world where adaptation is highly important for the development of the economy, we win this debate, right? Three main advantages that you win for our side. First of all, you have the stability, which most of the people needed, because in times of crisis, for example, when you have to impose austerity measures, supporting the costs of the economic crisis should not necessarily be in the burden of the middle class. and of the low class, who are the most vulnerable people, because these kind of people are going to find it even more difficult to redress themselves, right? So the smartest strategical move in an economy would be protecting these kind of people through unions, and not necessarily allowing like the cold capitalistic society to do whatever they want, right? Because the consequences of a crisis are even more detrimental, right? So I believe that by all these points, I also pointed out that their extension about flexibility and about how inefficient workers cannot be laid off and how this is way worse, we believe that we prove you how, because of the fact that adaptation of labor unions, in order for them to actually have a collaboration between the middle class and between corporations, allow us to actually have the stability to that extent to which every single union is kind of protected. On the comparative, in their world they're not. And the consequences of when people need it the most and in times of crisis are even more detrimental on their side. So we believe that in order for them to win this debate, they need to prove that every single disadvantage that they actually pointed out to the point of unions is actually mitigated in their world, and every single advantage that they have on legislation actually works when people are not necessarily counterbalanced by the stability that unions would afford.
We thank the GovWeb for the fine summation, and we welcome the opposition to some of the side and close this debate here.
Three questions. First, who gets this policy? Secondly, what changes better for the workers? And lastly, what are the economic repercussions of powerful unions? Because I don't think closing government specifically dealt with a huge part of Zoe's extension when she did talk about when the economic repercussions, especially in post-crisis worlds or during the crisis, how unions drag down firms' ability to actually make the correct, efficient decisions, and why legislators are in the best epistemic position to mitigate and balance those different concerns between different groups. So who gets their solutions? Two things I want to say under this. Firstly, this debate should actually be about which solution is best, granting both solutions some efficacy. I don't think OG ever gave opposition this. But if OG wants to question how we get this legislation, Zoe told you that the same people that might join these unions or people outside of the unions can just vote for individuals, political parties that then just put forward and that advocate those protections for workers. So they can use the vote to get this legislation. That was the clear argument all up and down opposition bench. No, thank you. So I think that question is settled. So what changes better for the workers? So on government side, people are pushed to unions and away from legislation when they're told by the unions that they should go just to their union heads for recourse and for issues that matter, not the legislation. So we get less legislation for the protection unions on government side of the house. So thank you. So I think there's two groups then that we need to talk about. Firstly, union members. Union members, and secondly, the part-time workers or the non-union workers, those two groups within that second category. So I think there's three harms that union members actually have on their side of the house. Firstly, they're forced into bargaining. So this mandated joining from the stronger unions on their side of the house is just an abridgment of a lot of workers' rights to actually freely choose what jobs they actually want to go to, and I think this is actually very important. Secondly, though, there's less access to courts on their side of the house because unions discourage individuals from going to courts because they need to maintain that very important negotiation power, no thank you, that they have with corporations. If they need to maintain that relationship, they clearly have incentives to discourage workers from defacing that corporation itself. That's clearly a reason why there's less access to courts. But I think on the comparative, no thank you, our legislative recourse creates an environment where the government and the state themselves have this responsibility and this duty to go in and investigate these acts and create a world in which the legislation furthers the rights of workers, no thank you, because an investigation and safety standards and the laws and the legislation create better safety prior to these harms, rather than having, no thank you, the unions deal with harms after they've already occurred. So we win on the time scale there, and that's very important. The third harm to union members, no thank you, is that the benefits that GovBench wanted to talk to you about are actually very unstable. So he told you that there's an inability to predict the actual outcomes of union negotiations when they have to renegotiate the same terms 10, 20 years down the line. So during those times, people who are actually working and are part of these unions don't actually know what the outcomes of those negotiations are, whereas legislation is actually very stable. In the United States, minimum wage has never been regressively acted upon. It's only been moved up and forward. So I think legislation is a comparatively more stable, no thank you, mechanism for protecting the rights of workers. And I think it's just clear to say that union negotiations only benefit those groups within the unions. And there's also a lot of instances where union members are bribed and union leaders are bribed, no thank you, by corporations. So it's not comparatively easier for the corruption to occur on our side of the house. So what happens to part-time workers and non-union workers? So unions just can't protect these individuals. So he told you, and never addressed by the whip on closing, why service economies and just the gig economy that exists, things like Uber and things that are increasing up, unions can't protect them because they're smaller. There's more unique jobs. They're very varied. Compare farmers and teachers to data jobs, baggers of grocery stores, all of the variety of those jobs that unions just can't. No, thank you. Just can't defend. But then the smaller size of those singular jobs creates less dues, which means unions don't even have an incentive to form. So we've established that we can't protect part-time workers and non-union workers. Back out.
Sir, when you have powerful unions, you might have an influence on the singular jobs as well from the government because of the pressure that labor unions have. On your side, you have no advantages for your singular examples as well.
I think it's been established up and down opposition bench that legislation impacts everyone in the society, minimum wage impacts everyone in the society, and just safety regulations and safety administration also impacts all the different workers. And legislation can also be targeted to help certain groups and certain other groups. So I think that's pretty clear. So secondly, though, under this is that the unions, as I said in my point of information, unions have incentives to protect those individuals within their unions at the expense of all the individuals outside of the unions in order to maintain the camaraderie, in order to maintain the solidarity of the relationship of the union. So it hurts those individuals outside of the union. No, thank you. What is the comparative? Legislation has effects on non-unions, and the political capital spent on union gains take away from legislation. We told you why recourse is better. But then, no thank you. If unions are bad, we don't want them at all, which was conceded in a question in opening government. But honestly, legislation could never happen from the status quo, but if unions are themselves bad, we shouldn't want more unions. So I think that's the clear way on those terms. No thank you. Second question, what are the economic repercussions of powerful unions? Because I think this is a lot of the extension, really big impacts that they just didn't deal with. So legislation is, legislative measures, no thank you, is in the best epistemic position to balance the needs of different groups within societies. That's both the corporations, the workers, and the state itself. Government wanted to tell you that the workers themselves are the best group that wants to make these decisions. No thank you. But that means that these unions are only blindsided to what is best for their workers, not what is best for the long-term development of the state, which is why legislation, when they talk to corporations and they know what they need and know how to create stable corporations, the long-term outcomes there are clearly benefits for our side of the house. Why is this? Corporations, when they're forced to keep inefficient workers and reduce market mobility, this under the guise that it's good for workers, create inefficiencies in the market, and this decreases economic growth when you don't have massive productivity on behalf of these corporations. That's literally their job, to create an output and pay their workers. But secondly, during times of crises, you get worse when firms fail. The state has to step in, and then you get a 20-year period, like say in Japan, when they basically have no economic growth at all because the state now has to fund inefficient workforces that are protected by unions. That's awful. And in terms of the current economic trends that Zoe also gave you, the middle class is the most important one. We agree this CG whip, but it's not the workers that are most part of the middle class, it's the service industries that aren't actually being protected by the unions. And that's exactly the group that we benefit on our side of the house, and we benefit everyone because legislation is an overarching, all-encompassing way to benefit the most amount of people in society and get economic growth. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
We thank the whip and all the speakers, and I encourage you all to be join us after the break. I will take my notes. I'll make sure that I can